In 1925, the city of Paris decided to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap. It was only ever meant as a short-term exhibit. It didn't fit in with the other features of the city, and it cost an absolute fortune to maintain. 6 scrap dealers were contacted in great secrecy. They met with a representative of the city who swore them to silence. Secret bids were placed, and one was accepted from a small-time merchant looking to make it big, André Poisson. It was a great deal. It would announce him as a major player in the Parisian industrial scene. There was only one catch. The city official he was dealing with didn't actually work for the Parisian authorities. He was a con man named Victor Lustig, who had pulled off one of the greatest deceptions of all time and was now speeding away on a train to Vienna with a suitcase full of André Poisson's cash. André Poisson didn't know who he was dealing with, and so he didn't respond as he should, and it proved to be a very costly mistake. In this series of talks, we're thinking about life unlocked, and the central contention is going to be that Jesus Christ unlocks true life for us. He enables us to live our lives now as they were made to be lived, knowing our Creator as our Father, and learning to treat one another in the way Jesus himself treated people. And he's able to secure for us an eternal life that will stretch beyond this lockdown, coronavirus, and even beyond death itself, into a never-ending paradise. And so the key question for this series, and really for all of life, is who is Jesus? Around the world, there are millions of people who have staked everything on Jesus being who he says he is. They've built their lives around it. They make choices every day based upon it. How they spend their money, how they conduct their relationships, what they do with their time. If Jesus Christ is like Victor Lustig, they've made a huge mistake. If Jesus is a con artist, or has been made out to be something he's not, then Christians are like poor old André Poisson, and will eventually be left shamefaced and embarrassed. But on the flip side, if Jesus is who he says he is, then the Christian's response to him is a no-brainer. If he is the all-powerful creator of the universe who loves the people he's made, then choosing to live as he dictates is not a constrained, limited existence. It is true freedom. Life lived as it was meant to be lived. And it's those who think he's not who he says he is who are making a disastrous mistake. These are strange times, aren't they? Times in which all of our preconceptions and ways of living life are being challenged. We honestly think at Grace Church that being a Christian is the greatest help, and that this crisis is highlighting why it's so valuable to know Jesus and why it's so important that we turn to him and be reconciled to God through him. Knowing Jesus is better than having a bank balance that will never run out in the midst of the economic stresses. It's better than having a vaccine that will mean we never catch the virus. That is what Christians honestly think, and they wouldn't trade in knowing Jesus for either of those two things or for anything else. But that perspective all hangs on the question of who is Jesus. If he's just another moral teacher or a good man or a made-up figment of someone's overactive imagination, then Christianity offers no hope whatsoever. Who is Jesus? We're going to try and answer that by looking at Mark's Gospel. It's one of 4 historical accounts of Jesus' life found in the Bible. It's put together using eyewitness testimony and is a vital primary document for ascertaining who Jesus is. And right at the start of it, Mark, our author, tells us who he thinks Jesus is. Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Christ isn't a surname, it's a title, and it's taken straight out of the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, dealing with the time before Jesus came. Christ means anointed one, and Israel's kings were the anointed ones. And so the promised Christ was to be God's ultimate king, who in fact was none less than God himself. And so Mark is claiming that Jesus is God right from the outset. God who has come down to earth to act as king and to set earth to rights. And he thinks that this coming of Jesus is good news. That's what the word gospel means. It's a message we need to hear, and it's a message we should want to hear. What's the best news you could imagine hearing right now? Perhaps that a coronavirus vaccine has been found, or that 90% of the country have had the virus without knowing it, and we've all got immunity. Can you imagine how you'd feel if you heard that? If you turned on the radio or turned on your TV and saw a revived Boris Johnson declaring that it was all over? Wouldn't that be the best news? Well, Mark says that that's the sort of news he's got to tell us about Jesus. I don't know what your impression of Christianity is. Perhaps you've had some negative experiences in the past, and to your mind it can only ever be connected with feelings of foreboding. Perhaps your impression of Christians is that they seem to be a bit of a miserable bunch. No fun, no booze, no life. Maybe you grew up thinking that Christianity was all about being a good guy and going along to church, and neither of those was much fun. Well, Mark's convinced that Jesus offers us good news, not bad, and he intends his gospel, his account of Jesus' life, to offer the proof of it. I wonder what you'd expect God to do if he came down to earth. Deal with sickness like the coronavirus? Tell people what to do? Zap a few bad guys? Well, as you read through this account of Jesus' life, you get to see the answer. Here's what God did when he came to earth. The search for God is over. No need to look any further. Here he is. Why don't you make it your task during this lockdown to read through Mark's Gospel from cover to cover? You'll easily find it online if you don't have a Bible at home. It'll only take you an hour or so to read it from the start to the end. And that'll give you the best insight into who Jesus is, provide you with great encouragement if you already know him as your Lord and Saviour, and give you the best evidence if you're not convinced by the claims he makes. We're going to take a look at just one piece of evidence Mark offers us now. You may have heard of some of the miracles that Jesus did. He was certainly known at the time to be someone who did some impressive things. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian and certainly not a friend of Christianity, calls him a doer of wonderful deeds. And we certainly see plenty of wonderful deeds in the opening chapters of Mark's account. Jesus teaches with such authority that people drop everything to follow him. Enormous crowds gather at his door, imploring him to heal their sick relatives. And he does. And in chapter 4, he does something so remarkable that his closest followers have no idea what to make of it. Mark chapter 4 and verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. The other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" These blokes Jesus with are experienced fishermen. This is no pleasure cruise filled with wannabe sailors. These are hardened nautical men. The Sea of Galilee, where they were, is notorious, though, for these sort of storms. And so these sailors are caught right in the middle of a catastrophic event, and they are absolutely terrified for their lives. They go to Jesus with a desperate question. It's one which people have brought to God again and again through the ages, and which is being asked with great urgency at the moment. Do you not care that we are perishing? Does it bother you, God, if we die? I wonder if you found yourself wondering that in the face of the coronavirus or something similar. Those awful daily updates we get of those who have died. Is God bothered? Does he care? That's an important question, isn't it? A very personal one. And for many, it's the question that disproves the Bible's claims. How can there be a loving God who is all-powerful when there's so much suffering in the world? Do you not care that we are perishing, God? Well, what does Jesus do? Verse 39, and he awoke, and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. From 1982 through to 1983, the US government ran something called Project Storm Fury. It was an attempt to weaken tropical storms using chemical-spreading aircraft. Well, they were 2,000 years late. Here's a man who can control the weather totally, not through fancy technology, but simply by using his vocal cords. Human beings don't have this sort of power, but the opening chapters of the Bible talk about God making the world by speaking. And here, in front of these sailors, is Jesus exercising the same power. No wonder the disciples are terrified in verse 41. They ask, "Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him?" It's not the storm that they're afraid of. It's the man in front of them. And they stumble onto the same question that we have. Who is this man? Now, what's striking is that Jesus doesn't think it's okay for them not to know. He doesn't think it's okay for them to stay in their ignorance. In our culture, in our setting, agnosticism, saying that we just can't know about God, it has a certain respectability. It comes across as humble, non-prejudiced, open-minded, all qualities that we value. But Jesus says that agnosticism, saying that we just can't know about God, it's not a wise worldview. And when you're faced with a man who is demonstrating his divine power, it's not a legitimate worldview. Verse 40, he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Jesus expects these fishermen to come to an answer about who he is. If they had done, they wouldn't be worried about the storm. They wouldn't have questioned whether Jesus cared for them. They would have trusted him. Now, don't get me wrong, it's good to be open-minded, but as someone else once quipped, the point of having an open mind is so that you can close it on something. There's no point having an inquiring mind if you're not prepared to follow the evidence and draw some conclusions. Here's one piece of evidence Mark offers for who Jesus is, and it answers the questions in our passage. Who is Jesus? Well, he's the God who controls the world, the God who made the world, and the God to whom one day the world will answer. Does he care that these disciples are perishing? Oh, yes, he does. Rather than make them ride out the storm to teach them a lesson, he gets up and tells the storm to pipe down as if it was just a naughty puppy. If we had more time, we'd read on to the next chapter where Jesus goes a step further. When met by a grieving father whose little girl has died, he does the unthinkable. He calls her back to life. He's offering an insight into his ultimate response to our suffering when he will die in brutal fashion and rise again 3 days later so that he can offer to us life beyond death, offering it to all, giving it to all who turn to him for it. Why not look that up for yourself later? It's in Mark chapter 5. But where does what we've seen today leave us? Who is Jesus? Well, if, like Mark, you say Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the one who calms storms and cares deeply, can you see that turning to him in the midst of this coronavirus storm brings great reassurance? We feel, don't we, like those disciples in the boat at the moment. Perhaps some of us feel like that grieving father. Well, take heart. Jesus claims to be the God who in his compassion for us can help us and give us hope. And he's backed it up. He's shown he's not all talk. He follows through on what he promises. Remember some of those precious things he says to us, which he will deliver on. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. If you're not sure who Jesus is, or you're unconvinced so far, I wonder what you feel you would need to know. What would you need to find out more to persuade you? What questions would you want answered about Jesus? Is your mind open? Are you ready to make an honest inquiry? Well, if so, do join us again next week, next Sunday, at Grace Church, or if you're watching on the video, wait for next week's video to come up. We'll be considering what Jesus has to say about our world and the state it's in. But in the meantime, why not email in a question to info@gracechurchnewtonhall.org. I'll do my best to answer any questions via email, and depending on how many we get, we might put together a little video so that others can listen in as well. But for now, thanks for listening.